Welcome. This is the introductory overview for the TESL online pronunciation course offered by Conestoga College. I'm going to be doing this presentation in several parts. It's actually a 3-hour presentation when I teach it at the college in the daytime TESL program, and I'm hoping that it will allow you to understand where it is that I think you can go with teaching pronunciation with your ESL classes and give you a solid background for the course. So once again, welcome, and let's get started. I have to apologize for a bit of background noise. I've been waiting for it to be quiet here at home, but that's not going to happen, and my daughter's running a bath now, so I'll just talk as clearly as I can. I think it's important for you to think about where you're going to be teaching pronunciation. What context are you going to find yourself in? Because that does determine the way that you teach pronunciation and what you teach. If you're teaching ESL, as I've done for most of my life here in Canada, I think that a lot of the focus needs to be on the suprasegmental aspects, on the stress, the rhythm, the intonation, because individuals want to sound listenable, not just clear in job search activities, community-oriented events, friendship, etc., with both native and non-native speakers. And you need to think about what practice your students have as non-native speakers. Are they talking to native speakers or mostly to other non-native speakers in the classroom? I think you need to look at making sure the samples that you're using are effective speech for social and work situations. And the prosody, which is really the suprasegmentals plus a real awareness of how people sound at a top-down level in pronunciation, and pragmatics really become key. There are a lot of issues and questions related to acceptance and how to approach people, and the focus on how the learner wants and needs to sound to get ahead in the new society they find themselves in. If, on the other hand, you're teaching EFL, English as a foreign language, where the ambient language is not English, there are other things you need to take into account. There's not a social or integrative function in general for the language learning. There's little chance for practice, therefore pronunciation is usually taught a little bit more clinically. Very technical, rule-oriented focus can occur. On the purpose may be literary or test-related, with a lot of focus on vocabulary and grammar and translation and the language learning in general. And generally the focus, or at least the practice that's available, is non-native speaker to non-native speaker. And then I've been very interested in Jennifer Jenkins' suggestions over the last few years about English for international communication. And she's got a number of suggestions. I'm really grossly generalizing them here for the hyperarticulation of segmentals and a focus on main stress, given that it's mostly non-native speakers to non-native speakers in a business or non-social environment. All right, so think about where you're going to be teaching and what that might mean to what we're discussing. There are two very complementary focuses in the teaching of pronunciation. One is in helping individuals to decode pronunciation, the perception of pronunciation. When someone hears a native or non-native speaker using a particular stress, rhythm, or intonation, or a particular consonant or way of pronouncing a consonant, is that person able to understand what was intended by the speaker? In terms of encoding, the production of pronunciation, can the individual use the pronunciation of the language in order to have other individuals understand them? Some people think that the decoding is better done before the encoding, but I actually think the opposite is the case, that by practicing encoding, you are actually able to decode more successfully. But they do go hand in hand, and both can work, and some individuals do better with one focus initially and some with another. I think it's incredibly important that both ESL learners and ESL teachers, and I think ESL learners actually already realize this, but ESL teachers sometimes don't. Pronunciation is not some kind of icing on the cake that can be left to the end. It's an integral part of how people are perceived, and it goes in tandem with a number of other concepts. So I take a top-down approach to teaching pronunciation, and I developed a lot of these ideas while I was working with highly trained, highly educated immigrants to Ontario, doctors, pharmacists, engineers, etc., who were trying to get back into the job market. So I'm going to go through very quickly the order in which a job interviewer would notice some of your behaviors, whether you're a native speaker or non-native speaker. And the first thing would be the overall affect. What are the expectations of clothing and accoutrements, facial expression, tone of voice, material, etc.? And how do those differ interculturally? And then body language. What would be the expectations for oculesics, or use of the eyes, your posture, your haptics, gestures, head nods and tilts, etc.? For example, Canadian-born English-speaking native speakers of English, women will nod their head 2 to 3 times during a job interview to show enthusiasm on almost every statement, and men will nod their heads 1 to 2 times. What happens if your learners come from a culture where head nodding is not as popular? People will notice the suprasegmentals, and that's what we'll spend a lot of time talking about in this teaching pronunciation course. The phrasing and thought groups, the intonation curves, main syllable stress, content versus function words, reductions, and linking. And of course, if the vowels and consonants are not clear or not clear enough, there may be miscommunication, so those definitely have to be looked at as well. If you were able to see me right now, you'd have a lot more information about who I am and how I might behave in certain situations. But those cues are not available to you right now because you can't see me and you cannot access these cues. You have to rely entirely on my pronunciation, on the way that I'm using my voice. But it's important to realize that these cues are used in tandem with the voice in order to deliver messages, and that you as a teacher are being observed by your students, and you're observing your students and perhaps misinterpreting them on the basis of these cues because they vary very dramatically interculturally. So I'm just going to run through them now, and they'll pop up again and again as we talk about pronunciation. The noise in the background is my dog Bear chewing on a bone. I've tried to get things quiet, but it is impossible, so I apologize. Oculesics is the use of the eyes, and Canadian English-speaking teachers will use the eyes to scan for control in the classroom, and they will expect students to make eye contact with them as they're looking around to make sure everyone's paying attention. Facial expression, frequent smile, soft mouth is expected both in the teaching of ESL and in job interview situations. So how does that impact on whether or not someone's willing to listen to your pronunciation or what you're saying? Head movement. Lots of tilting and nodding occurs in Canadian English. That's not necessarily the same in every culture, so start to notice what you're doing and how it ties in with what you're saying. Proxemics, teachers who are successful in the Canadian classroom tend to step forward on questions, inviting them, and show fair movement in the classroom, moving from one side of the classroom to the other, from the back to the front. They show a relaxed posture. Many ESL students have suggested to me that it's probably too relaxed in comparison with their own expectations. Haptics, Canadian English speakers will touch their own chest area and words on the board very frequently, showing a lot of animation. Intonation and volume will have a range of 5, so quite dramatic differences, often at the high range for ESL teachers. Getting too excitable in the classroom is not generally welcomed by Canadian English speakers. And gestures, deictic, iconic, and batonic, we'll talk a little bit about as we start to look at how pronunciation actually matches up with a lot of other nonverbal cues. I think a lot of the lack of success in teaching pronunciation can be attributed to teachers who stayed too much at the teacher-directed, content-based end of the continuum. I do go to this end, and in fact with a new class where the expectations of the students might be for this, I'll start here and quickly dance to the other end. But let's look at what happens here. Here there's a lot of repetition, and that repetition is of a very controlled set of words, phrases, and minimal pairs, and discussion of technical aspects of production. This is very bottom-up processing, and there's usually a focus on a short-term ability to perform what the teacher has asked, and the targets are teacher-selected for the most part, so students are working with what the teacher gives them, not what they might need to say. Sometimes there's incredibly artificial examples with minimal pairs. I think there's a classic one, the sheep slept in, no, the sheep slipped in their sleep on the ship or something like that. Totally useless in normal production, and very low on Bloom's taxonomy, which is not good educational practice. So I think it's a good idea to think about the fact that in our pronunciation teaching we want to move quickly up Bloom's taxonomy. We do want students to remember, understand, and apply various pronunciation concepts, but they've got to move on to analyzing, evaluating, and creating pronunciation that they can use in the real world for the purposes that they want. So what does the ideal pronunciation class look like? Although we need to include the technical aspects, I think it's really important that we move as quickly as possible to this type of a classroom. Learners need to feel a reason for changing the particular pronunciation you're working on, and they need to imagine where they can use it outside of the classroom. Phrases need to be directed at imagined friends, co-workers, customer service people. They can't just be random pieces of language. Nonverbal aspects need to be included, and we need to talk about pronunciation for dealing with really tricky communication situations, unexpected responses, attitudes, etc. I'd like to see the learners actively creating and recreating how they want to sound in encounters in English. So you've got to talk about, do you want to sound pushy here? Do you want to sound friendly? Are you trying to sound conciliatory? There has to be a focus on long-term aims. Targets need to be realistic and mostly learner-donated. They need to have the pronunciation carry over into speech outside the classroom, and assessment needs to reflect the free use of language. So we're talking here about a lot of top-down processing, low anxiety, lots of experimenting, and rewards and punishments being very much something that students are aware of in terms of how native speakers and other non-native speakers might respond. There are two models for pronunciation teaching, the transmission model and the transformation model. And the transmission model is one that's had long historical use. This is where the teacher is expected to provide an exact model for the learners to produce, and it always makes me a little uncomfortable because both the teacher and the students will talk about correct pronunciation or the right way of saying things. And if you've looked at language at all, you realize that there is no one correct right way to pronounce or to say something. But learners here are very confident, the rules seem to be very clear. And the students generally, if you stay within this model, won't want to work with each other because they believe only the teacher can provide them with the correct pronunciation. I'm very uncomfortable with this model. So in this 48-hour course, I want to try my best to bring you towards a transformation model of pronunciation teaching. This is a model where the teacher and the learners, depending on their level and their ability to discuss and talk about these issues in English, are really looking at what it means to add or to change pronunciation. And some of the things I've talked about with learners are the fear of not being able to change pronunciation. That has to be on the table. And what their particular phobias are at this point in time. For example, a Korean student might be very much afraid of even trying to change the sound z in zoo because people have unsuccessfully taught them before. What are the learners thinking and feeling, and what are their values associated with sounding a certain way? How uncomfortable might they be to sound a different way? How can we make them more comfortable with the teaching methods that we might be using, that we believe in, but that might be not familiar educationally? Possible sense of loss in attaining an English native-like pronunciation. Why would they want to go to that level? Sense of disenfranchisement at not attaining a certain pronunciation, etc., etc. My throat's getting a little bit sore, so I'm going to stop for now. You can read the rest, and I very much look forward to the course and to continuing with the introduction.